Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into something pretty fundamental, an idea that really challenges how we see the most common substance on Earth, water. We're not just talking HO, the chemical formula. No, we're exploring this, well, radical notion that water might be more than inert molecules, that it could be a living, dynamic intelligence.
That's right. The sources we're looking at today talk about the hidden intelligence of water. And the core idea we really need to unpack is this concept of water as the actual matrix of life, meaning it's capable of holding information, structuring it, maybe even transmitting it.
Right. And our mission here is to kind of navigate these pretty profound claims. Our sources, they draw a lot from people like Veda Austin, others doing similar work. And they propose that water might have a kind of molecular memory, a structural integrity way beyond what we normally think, and that it actively responds.
Correct. To intention, sound, vibration.
Yeah, it's like there's this whole communication system hidden right there in plain sight.
Precisely. These sources really treat water as highly reactive. It's not presented as just passive, it's listening in a way. The whole premise is that this intelligence is observable if we know how to look, specifically through the structures water forms.
Okay, let's unpack that. So if water is intelligent, how does it talk back? What's the evidence they present for this communication through vibration and thought?
Well, the main method they explore, really in depth, is this process of freezing water samples. Samples that have been deliberately exposed to different intentions or energies. And when this, let's call it treated water, is frozen, the ice crystals that form, well, they're allegedly not random at all.
Not random, how?
The claim is that the crystalline images, the geometries you see, actually reflect the specific energy or the intention that was focused on the water right before it froze.
Okay, now that is where it gets really interesting. Can you paint a picture? I mean, what does this communication actually look like? How is water that heard something positive different from water exposed to negativity?
The visual difference, according to these sources, is, well, it's striking. They show that water exposed to positive, coherent energy, think harmonious music, or maybe written words like love or gratitude, it forms these incredibly intricate, symmetrical, complex, hexagonal structures.
Like snowflakes, but reflecting intention.
Exactly. Beautiful geometric patterns. They're seen as signaling coherence and order within the water.
And the flip side, if the energy is, say, chaotic or negative,
then the sources claim the water often fails to form those organized structures. You might get fractured, disorganized shapes, or sometimes really no discernible crystalline structure at all, just kind of amorphous chaos.
Yeah.
This is what they mean when they say water is literally talking back through its geometry.
We should probably mention the history here. This isn't entirely out of the blue, right? The sources link Veda Austin's recent work to earlier research.
Oh, absolutely. They definitely connected to Masaru Emoto's pioneering work. He really popularized the idea that water crystals could be influenced by human thought and intention.
Right. Emoto's photos of water crystals were quite famous.
Yeah, his work freezing water samples and photographing the results, often under a dark field microscope. It really laid the groundwork for these kinds of claims. It showed, or suggested at least, that consciousness could impact the physical state of water. It gives context that this is an ongoing field of inquiry.
Now, I do have to bring in a bit of, let's say, listener perspective here. For many people, these claims about intention-changing ice crystals, well, they sit pretty far outside conventional, peer-reviewed science. Do the sources you looked at acknowledge that? Do they address things like experimental controls or, the potential subjectivity in interpreting these images?
That's a really important point. The sources themselves, they tend to operate more from the premise that the phenomenon is visually verifiable. They talk about achieving reproducible results through meticulous protocols. But yes, they often position themselves somewhat outside the strictly quantitative methods of mainstream physics. Their core argument really remains that the visible changes in structure are just too consistent, too specific to the input, to be simply dismissed as chance or placebo, at least within their framework.
Okay, that's helpful context. So we're analyzing the claims within this particular body of work, which relies heavily on these visual patterns reflecting intention. Now let's take that idea, observing water externally, and bring it inside. Because the really fascinating implication here is for the human body, right? We know our bodies are, over 70% water.
70%, yeah. It's a staggering amount of this supposedly responsive substance. If water structure is dynamic and rejects external inputs, well, that raises some profound questions about our own internal molecular state.
So, what does it mean for us if the water inside us carries not just structure, but potentially memory, like a liquid recording device? What's actually being recorded inside us moment to moment?
This is exactly where the concept of liquid consciousness comes into play. The sources define it quite clearly. If the water making up, you, is constantly being subjected to your thoughts, your joy, your fear, your stress, then every thought, every word, every environmental input is, quite literally, shaping the molecular geometry inside your body.
Wow.
You can almost think of the water in your body less like just a simple solvent, and maybe more like a biological hard drive, or maybe a vast library that's constantly being updated.
A library, I like that analogy. So the disorganized, chaotic patterns seen in some ice crystals, could that potentially mirror what's happening at a cellular level if we're constantly feeding our system stressful negative input?
That's precisely the implication.
It makes something like mindfulness feel suddenly very physical, not just a mental exercise.
Absolutely. And this leads directly to the concept that's really central in much of this material, structured water.
Okay, let's pause there. We need to define that for the listener. What exactly is structured water according to these sources? How is it different from just regular H2O?
Right. So structured water is described as water that's been intentionally organized into highly coherent geometric states. It's often described as forming hexagonal or crystalline clusters rather than the more random molecular groupings found in, say, typical tap water.
And what's the functional difference? Why does that structure matter?
Well, the sources suggest that structured water is energetically superior, more bioavailable. Think of it like this. Trying to run a marathon, dragging a completely tangled rope versus running with a neatly coiled one. Randomly clustered water molecules might be less efficient for cellular processes. Maybe the cells need more energy to utilize it. Structured water, because of its opposite geometric order, is said to be highly efficient. It's claimed to move energy better, maybe help clear cellular waste more effectively, and just generally support the whole system much better.
Okay, so the big application here, which the source material really emphasizes, is this idea of healing potential. That by consuming or maybe even just being exposed to positively structured water, we could essentially upgrade our own internal water matrix, leading to better health.
That's the core premise, yes.
Yeah.
The idea is that having an organized internal liquid matrix is basically synonymous with optimal health and vitality. It shifts the whole conversation from just staying hydrated to something more like information transfer within the body.
That really does shift the scale dramatically. We've gone from a single ice crystal reflecting intention to potentially restructuring the water in our own bodies for health benefits. But, okay, let's zoom out even further now. What about the planet? How does this idea of water intelligence manifest on a global scale, according to these sources?
This is where we get into what the sources often call ocean consciousness. The idea is, if water works as a memory and transmission system at the cellular level, then why not on a planetary scale? They broaden this to suggest that the Earth's water, primarily the oceans, might act as a kind of global communication network, or perhaps even like a single vast interconnected consciousness.
The ocean as a global nervous system, that's a huge concept.
Yeah.
Do they give specific examples of how information might be carried or stored in the oceans?
Yeah, the focus tends to shift towards large-scale aquatic features and life. For instance, massive ocean currents aren't just seen as regulating temperature. The sources view them as these vast, slow-moving carriers of information, circulating planetary memory, energetic data across the globe.
Okay. And what about life within the ocean?
Well, certain entities, particularly whales, are often highlighted. They're seen as conscious carriers, even maybe stewards, of information within this system.
Whales. How so? Like specialized nodes in this network.
Kind of, yeah. The argument is that given their huge size, their long lifespans, their incredibly complex and deep acoustic communication, whales might be essential transmitters of deep planetary memory and intelligence, their songs, their migrations. And these aren't viewed just as biological imperatives, but potentially as complex, conscious ways of dispersing information throughout this wider ocean consciousness matrix.
That's a profoundly different perspective on marine biology. It transforms the deep sea from this sort of silent, vast emptiness into an actively communicating living library.
A library constantly being updated and circulated by currents and creatures, yes.
And this connects to spiritual traditions too, doesn't it?
It really does. The source material often delves into how water, metaphorically and sometimes literally, is seen across many cultures as the mirror of the soul.
A mirror of the soul, because it reflects back the energy, the intention directed at it, whether that's from a researcher looking at an ice crystal or maybe the collective consciousness of humanity.
Exactly. That spiritual connection emphasizes that this intelligence is pervasive, It links the vastness of the ocean right down to the tiny water molecules inside our own cells. The implication is that, by being mindful of the energy we put out, we're not just affecting ourselves, but potentially influencing the collective planetary water matrix too. It reflects a core spiritual idea in a very physical, very liquid way.
This has certainly been a deep dive, taking us from the tiniest crystal structure right up to the entire ocean. I think the key takeaway, regardless of where you stand on the conventional science side, is pretty clear from these sources. Water, in this view, isn't just inert stuff we drink. It's presented as the fundamental matrix of life, a dynamic intelligence that seems to respond actively to the world around it, influenced by intention, structure, coherence.
And that leaves us with perhaps the most profound idea raised in this body of work. The fact that you, the listener, are quite literally made of this potentially intelligent substance. The sources strongly suggest that by learning to honor water, maybe by paying attention to the quality of water we interact with, the intentions we hold, we're essentially optimizing our own internal library. That by restoring coherence to our internal liquid matrix, we might actually begin to, as they put it, remember more about who we really are, unlocking deeper aspects of ourselves. So the final provocative thought we want to leave you with is this. What kind of energy, what kind of information are you feeding the water that makes up you?